The night my sister tried to humiliate me in front of hundreds of guests. She had no idea that by the end of her speech, her entire world would begin to collapse. She thought she had carefully staged my public downfall at our father's 60th birthday party, but what she didn't know was that I wasn't walking into that ballroom alone or powerless. So, how did the family failure become the one holding all the cards? My name is Riley. I'm 28 years old, and I'm a ceramic artist. Clay is my language. The spinning wheel is my meditation, and the studio I built from nothing is the only place that ever truly felt like home. Tonight, I want to tell you the story of how I went from being the daughter my father threw out in the rain to the woman my sister never saw coming. The afternoon it all began, I was standing in my studio, hands deep in wet clay. The soft, rhythmic whir of the pottery wheel filled the space, steady and grounding. There's something about shaping earth with your hands that makes the rest of the world fade away. The scent of damp clay, the faint dust in the sunlight, the slow transformation of something shapeless into something intentional. It reminded me that beauty can come from pressure. That peaceful silence shattered when my phone began to ring. The sound echoed sharply off the exposed brick walls, jarring and intrusive. I wiped my hands on my canvas apron, leaving pale streaks across the fabric, and reached for my phone. The name glowing on the screen froze me in place. Stella. My older sister hadn't contacted me in over a year, not since the night I refused to follow our father's career plan and chose my own path instead. The message preview glared at me with a familiar edge of superiority. Come to Dad's birthday. Let's see who he's really proud of. It wasn't an invitation. It was a challenge. I could almost hear her voice in those words, sweet on the surface, venom underneath. Stella had spent our entire lives mastering that tone. She was polished, strategic, always perfectly aligned with our father's expectations. While I was covered in clay and stubborn dreams, she wore tailored suits and rehearsed ambition. A year ago, a message like that would have broken me. Back then, I still believed that if I just tried harder, if I just explained myself better, maybe our father would understand. Maybe he would see that success doesn't only come in spreadsheets and quarterly profits. But the last time I tried to make him understand, it ended with shattered pottery and a slammed door. I can still hear it. The heavy oak door of our family estate closing behind me with a final, echoing thud. Rain poured down in sheets that night, soaking through my thin jacket in seconds. Inside, in his study, my father Douglas had stood over the broken remains of my work, fragments of glazed vases scattered across the marble floor like pieces of my dignity. "You are a disgrace to this family," he had shouted, his face red with fury. "Playing with mud while real businesses are built. Come back when you learn how to make real money." He didn't just criticize me. He erased me. When he threw my final vase against the wall, something inside me cracked too, but not in the way he expected. I didn't beg. I didn't apologize. I just stood there, watching years of quiet effort reduced to shards. Then he told me to get out. So I did. I remember standing at the edge of the driveway, rain stinging my face, my suitcase half packed, and my future uncertain. The house behind me glowed warmly with golden light, my sister probably already preparing to step further into her role as the worthy heir. I called exactly one person that night, Chloe. My best friend didn't ask questions. She just said, "Stay where you are. I'm coming." When she pulled up in her battered sedan, heater barely working, she wrapped me in the kind of hug that says, "You're not alone." The weeks that followed were raw and disorienting. I had no safety net anymore, no trust fund, no family name cushioning my mistakes. I took the last of my savings and leased a rundown warehouse on the edge of town. It smelled like rust and old wood. The windows rattled when trucks passed. In winter, my breath fogged in the air while I worked. But it was mine. I painted the walls myself, installed shelves with borrowed tools. I worked 18 hours a day, throwing clay, firing kilns, sanding edges until my fingers ached. Some nights I slept on the floor between stacked boxes of unfinished pieces. There were moments I doubted everything. But every time I shaped a bowl from a spinning lump of clay, I felt something powerful. Control. Clay doesn't judge you. It doesn't compare you to your sister. It doesn't demand you become someone else. It responds to patience, to pressure, to steady hands. Slowly, orders began to trickle in. Then, more. A local restaurant commissioned custom dinnerware. A boutique interior designer placed a large order. My name, not my father's, started circulating quietly in creative circles. That afternoon in my studio, staring at Stella's message, I wasn't the same girl standing in the rain anymore. I had built something real. The irony was almost amusing. She thought she was summoning the failure back home to serve as a backdrop to her triumph. She probably imagined me sitting at the far end of the table, underdressed and uncomfortable, while she basked in our father's approval. But approval had stopped being my currency. I stared at the message for a long moment. The old reflex to shrink, to apologize for existing, flickered faintly, like a dying echo. Then it disappeared. Instead of anger, I felt something colder, calmer, a quiet readiness, because what Stella didn't know, what none of them knew, was how much had changed in a year. Not just my business, not just my confidence, my entire life. I typed back a short reply. I'll be there. As soon as I hit send, I felt a strange mix of anticipation and resolve. I wasn't going back to beg for acceptance. I wasn't going to defend my choices or seek reconciliation. I was going back to stand exactly as I am. And this time, I wouldn't be standing alone. The discarded daughter was coming home not to reclaim a seat at their table, but to show them she had built her own. So how did the girl they called a disgrace become the one who would change the entire atmosphere of that ballroom in a single night? That's where the real story begins. After I replied to Stella's message, I set my phone down on the wooden work table and let out a slow breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The studio was quiet again, but something inside me had shifted. Agreeing to go back wasn't weakness. It wasn't surrender. It was closure waiting to happen. Still, before I could face that ballroom, I found myself drifting back to the months that had shaped the woman I had become. The first few weeks after my father threw me out were the hardest of my life. Chloe's apartment was small, barely enough space for her, let alone an extra person, but she cleared off her couch without hesitation. She never once said, "I told you so," even though she had warned me for years that my father's love came with conditions. I remember lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of traffic outside her window, wondering if I had just destroyed my entire future over something as fragile as a dream. I had grown up in a house where success was measured in stock portfolios and board memberships. Creativity was tolerated as a hobby, never respected as a profession. Choosing pottery over business administration felt, to my father, like choosing irrelevance. But to me, clay had always been more honest than any balance sheet. It didn't pretend. It didn't inflate numbers. It responded only to effort and intention. With the last of my savings, I leased a rundown warehouse on the edge of town. When I first unlocked the rusted metal doors, I nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. The place smelled like damp wood and old machinery. The floor was uneven, the windows dusty, and the heating system barely functioned. But it was the only space I could afford. And more importantly, no one could take it away from me. Those first months were brutal. I worked 18 hours a day, my hands constantly raw from clay and water. I mixed glazes in chipped buckets and repaired secondhand kilns with YouTube tutorials playing in the background. I took small, custom orders, wedding centerpieces, handcrafted mugs, minimalist plates for local cafes. Every dollar mattered. Every sale felt like oxygen. There were nights when exhaustion hit so hard I questioned everything. I would sit on the cold concrete floor surrounded by half-finished pieces and think about the comfort I had walked away from the heated floors of my father's house, the certainty of a corporate job waiting if I simply apologized. Pride can be expensive. Independence, even more so. But every time I imagined crawling back, I saw the shards of my shattered vases at my father's feet, and I remembered the look in his eyes when he called me a disgrace. I refused to become someone who needed his permission to exist. It was during one of those long afternoons, when the air inside the warehouse felt thick with dust and frustration, that Julian walked through my doors for the first time. I was bent over a spinning wheel, shaping a wide-rimmed bowl, when I heard the faint creak of metal hinges behind me. I didn't look up immediately. Customers rarely came without calling first. "Am I interrupting something beautiful?" a calm voice asked. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a tall man in a simple dark jacket, hands tucked casually into his pockets. There was nothing flashy about him. No designer logos, no entourage, no air of entitlement. He introduced himself as Julian and said he was looking for custom dinnerware for a hospitality project he was developing. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't pry. He stayed longer than most customers. Instead of rushing through catalog samples, he watched me work. Not in a condescending way, but with genuine curiosity. He asked about the firing process, about glaze chemistry, about why I preferred a certain clay body over another. When I apologized for the mess around us, he smiled and said, "It looks like ambition to me." That was the first time anyone had described my chaos like that. Over the next few weeks, Julian kept returning, sometimes with design ideas, sometimes just to check on the progress of his order. He helped me carry heavy boxes of raw materials from delivery trucks. He held shelves steady while I drilled them into cracked walls. He showed up in jeans and rolled-up sleeves, not tailored suits. At the time, I assumed he was a small-scale developer trying to break into the boutique hotel market. He never mentioned money. He never hinted at influence. He treated me like an equal partner, not an artist he was rescuing. The first big order we completed together, the custom dinnerware for his new hotel, changed everything. When the installation photos were posted online, my pieces were credited prominently. Within days, my inbox flooded with inquiries. Interior designers from neighboring states reached out. A culinary magazine featured my work in a short spotlight article. For the first time, I felt the momentum shift. It wasn't overnight success. It was steady, earned growth. Julian eventually revealed the full scale of his business. The hospitality project turned out to be the foundation of a rapidly expanding boutique hotel chain, known for luxury rooted in authenticity rather than excess. When he told me he wanted my ceramics featured in every new location, I stared at him in disbelief. "Your work deserves a global audience," he said simply. Even then, he never acted like a savior. He signed contracts. He paid fair rates. He respected my timelines. And somewhere between kiln firings and late-night takeout dinners eaten on overturned crates, I fell in love with him not because of his success, but because he saw mine before anyone else did. Together, we transformed the warehouse. We installed proper heating, replaced cracked windows, hired 2 assistants. My studio became a space filled with light and laughter instead of desperation. I no longer measured my worth against my father's approval. I measured it against the steady expansion of something I had built with my own hands. When Stella's message arrived that afternoon, Julian was in the office corner reviewing a shipment manifest. I handed him the cream-colored envelope that had followed the text, a formal invitation embossed in gold script. He read it quietly, his expression calm but thoughtful. "Are you going?" he asked. "Yes," I said without hesitation, surprising even myself. He nodded slowly. "Then we'll go." There was something in the way he said "we" that grounded me. He knew the history. He had held me through nights when I woke from dreams of shattered pottery and slammed doors. He understood that this wasn't just a birthday party. It was a battlefield disguised as celebration. 2 days later, while I sketched new designs at my drafting table, my phone lit up repeatedly with Stella's messages. She dictated the dress code gold only. She warned me not to embarrass the family with my usual clothes, covered in mud. The insults were predictable, almost rehearsed. A year ago, they would have pierced me. Now, they barely grazed the surface. Instead of arguing, I closed my phone and reached for a different kind of weapon elegance. I commissioned a local seamstress to create a floor-length gown in antique gold silk, understated yet commanding. No logos, no excessive sparkle. Just quiet confidence woven into fabric. When I stood in front of the mirror after the final fitting, I didn't see the girl who had been thrown into the rain. I saw a woman who had survived it. And as Julian stepped up behind me, adjusting the delicate strap on my shoulder, He met my reflection with a soft smile. "They won't know what hit them," he murmured. But the truth was, this wasn't about hitting anyone. It was about standing tall in a room that once made me feel small. What my sister didn't understand, what my father had never understood, was that I wasn't coming back to prove them wrong. I was coming back because I no longer needed them to be right. 2 days before the party, my phone became a weapon in Stella's hands. It started early in the morning while I was reviewing glaze samples with my assistant. The screen kept lighting up, over and over again, her name flashing like a warning sign I couldn't mute fast enough. At first, I considered ignoring her, but curiosity won. The first message was about the mandatory gold theme. The second specified that it had to be elegant gold, not cheap gold. The third reminded me not to wear those clothes you usually ruin with mud. By the fifth message, she had moved on to instructing me about hairstyle options that would blend into the background. Blend into the background. That was her plan all along. She didn't want me absent. She wanted me present but small. She wanted me visible enough to compare, but insignificant enough to dismiss. A living reminder of what happens when you don't obey the family blueprint. A year ago, I would have typed out a defensive reply. Something sharp, something emotional. Instead, I placed my phone face down on the table and picked up my sketch pencil. If she wanted gold, I would give her gold, but not the kind she expected. That afternoon, I visited a local seamstress I'd worked with before, a quiet woman named Maribel, who understood that fabric, like clay, has memory. I showed her my design, a floor-length gown in antique gold silk, fluid but structured, understated yet impossible to ignore. No sequins screaming for validation. No designer logos stitched like badges of borrowed status. Just craftsmanship. As Maribel pinned the fabric along my shoulders, I studied myself in the mirror. There was something symbolic about choosing to wear gold, not as submission to Stella's theme, but as ownership of it. She thought gold meant wealth. I knew it meant resilience. Gold survives fire. It doesn't burn away. It refines. When I stepped out of the fitting room, Julian was waiting near the counter, leaning casually against the wall. His eyes softened when he saw me. "That's not just a dress," he said quietly. "That's armor." I smiled, but inside, a small flicker of anxiety remained. The closer the party came, the more I felt the weight of unfinished conversations pressing against my ribs. I hadn't seen my father in a year. I had replayed our last argument countless times in my mind, always wondering if there had been something I could have said differently. But then I would remember the sound of pottery shattering against marble, and the guilt would dissolve into clarity. The night before the party, Julian and I sat in the studio after everyone had gone home. The warehouse had transformed since those early months. The cracked windows were replaced, the floors leveled, the shelves organized with rows of finished pieces glowing softly under warm lights. It no longer smelled of damp wood, it smelled of clay and possibility. Julian was unusually quiet. "What are you thinking?" I asked. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick blue folder. My father's company logo was stamped in silver across the front. Seeing it again after so long stirred something uncomfortable in my chest. "I didn't want to tell you before," he began carefully, "but Travis has been trying to secure a meeting with me for weeks." I frowned. "About what?" "Investment. A significant one." I felt a strange mix of disbelief and irony. The party invitation suddenly made more sense. The lavish venue, the expensive champagne, the carefully curated guest list of bankers and potential investors. It wasn't just a birthday celebration. It was a performance. Julian opened the folder and handed it to me. Inside were financial projections, expansion plans, revenue charts on the surface. Impressive. But as I scanned the numbers, something felt off. The growth rates were inflated. The debt columns were suspiciously minimized. Certain liabilities were buried beneath optimistic footnotes. "They've submitted this 5 times, Julian said. Each time, the data was inconsistent. My stomach tightened. "They're leveraging company assets to fund their lifestyle," he continued. "Banks are pulling back. They need a miracle." For a moment, The old instinct to protect the family name flickered inside me. No matter how much pain they had caused, part of me had grown up believing that our legacy was untouchable. Seeing it reduced to manipulated spreadsheets felt surreal. "So the party," I murmured, "isn't just about turning 60, Julian finished. It's about securing survival." I closed the folder slowly. All those years, I had been made to feel like the reckless one, the irresponsible dreamer who didn't understand the real world. And now the empire built on discipline and tradition was quietly rotting from within. A strange calm settled over me. I had been afraid of walking into that mansion because I thought I would be the weakest person in the room. But the truth was, they were the ones drowning. The drive to Newport the next evening was smoother than I expected. The ocean stretched endlessly beside the highway, waves crashing against dark rocks as the sun dipped lower into the horizon. Julian's black sedan moved steadily along the coastal road, its interior quiet except for the faint hum of the engine. I watched the scenery blur past the window and tried to steady my breathing. "Are you nervous?" he asked gently, one hand resting on the steering wheel, the other reaching over to squeeze mine. "A little," I admitted. "Not about Stella. About him." He didn't need clarification. "I don't expect an apology," I said after a pause. "I just don't know how I'll feel when I see him." Julian nodded. "Whatever you feel is valid." There was no strategy session, no rehearsed confrontation. We weren't going there to destroy anyone. We were going because hiding no longer served me. As the iron gates of the Newport estate came into view, memories flooded back uninvited. Childhood birthdays on that manicured lawn, corporate dinners where I was expected to sit straight and speak little, the silent competition between Stella and me for a fraction of our father's approval. The mansion looked unchanged, grand, imposing, self-assured, but I wasn't the same girl approaching it. Before the car rolled to a stop at the entrance, Julian turned to me. His expression was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "I'll handle what needs to be handled," he said quietly. "You don't have to fight." I studied his face and realized something important in that moment. This wasn't about revenge for him, it was about integrity. He didn't tolerate deception in business, no matter who was involved. The fact that it happened to intersect with my past was coincidence, not motive. "Let's not make a scene unless we have to," I said softly. He gave a faint smile. "I never make scenes. I just make decisions." The valet opened my door, and the evening air wrapped around me, warm, heavy with the scent of trimmed hedges and ocean salt. From inside the mansion, music drifted outward, mingled with the low murmur of expensive conversations. I stepped out of the car carefully, smoothing the silk of my dress. The antique gold shimmered subtly under the lantern lights, not loud, not desperate, just present. Julian handed the keys to the valet but remained by the car for a moment longer. We had agreed he would enter separately. Timing, in rooms like this, mattered. As I walked up the stone steps alone, I felt the familiar weight of scrutiny waiting behind those doors. I could almost hear Stella's rehearsed introduction, see the curated seating chart designed to minimize me, but something had shifted inside me during that drive. I wasn't walking into a trap. I was walking into a room full of illusions, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of seeing them break. The moment I stepped through the double doors of the mansion, I felt it, the shift in air, the subtle tightening of conversations, the way eyes turned before whispers followed. The grand foyer was glowing in gold, just as Stella had demanded. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above polished marble floors, and a towering pyramid of champagne glasses sparkled beneath the lights. A string quartet played something soft and classical, elegant enough to impress, harmless enough not to distract from the real performance of the evening. And I knew, without anyone telling me, that I was part of that performance. My heels clicked against the marble as I walked further inside. I kept my shoulders straight, my chin lifted not in arrogance, but in refusal to shrink. The antique gold silk of my dress caught the light subtly, almost molten, and for a brief second I wondered if Stella would regret insisting on that color. I didn't have to wait long. She spotted me almost immediately. Stella moved through the crowd like someone accustomed to being admired. Her sequined gold gown glittered aggressively under the lights, each step calculated, each smile polished. When her eyes landed on me, her expression froze for half a second before reshaping into something sugary and sharp. "Well," she said as she approached, her voice low but edged, "you actually came." "Of course," I replied calmly. "It's Dad's birthday." Her gaze traveled slowly from my hair to the hem of my dress. I could see the flicker of irritation she tried to hide. She had expected something frumpy, something easy to criticize. Instead, I looked like I belonged. "That's a nice dress," she said, though the word nice sounded like an insult. "Is it rented?" I offered her a small smile. "No." She swirled her wine glass with a careless elegance. "Just remember," she murmured, leaning slightly closer, "this isn't your studio. Try not to embarrass us." Embarrass us. The irony almost made me laugh. Before I could respond, her attention shifted past me. I followed her gaze and saw my father standing near the fireplace, surrounded by bankers and old associates. Douglas looked exactly the same. Perfect tuxedo, silver hair combed back with precision, glass of scotch in hand. A man entirely at ease in rooms like this. For one fragile second, our eyes met. There was a flicker recognition, maybe even surprise, but it disappeared just as quickly. He turned his body slightly away, resuming his conversation as if I were a passing server instead of his daughter. That hurt more than I expected. Not because I needed his approval anymore, but because some small, stubborn part of me had hoped for a crack in his armor. A nod, a hesitation, anything that suggested regret. Instead, I was invisible. "Your seat is this way," Stella said briskly, snapping her fingers subtly at a nearby waiter. The young man approached me with apologetic eyes and gestured toward the far end of the ballroom. I followed him without protest, past the VIP table draped in gold linen, past the cluster of important guests positioned strategically near the stage. He led me to a small, undecorated table tucked beside the swinging kitchen doors. The placement was deliberate. Every time the doors flung open, the smell of butter and garlic drifted out, along with the frantic clatter of plates. From this corner, I could see the stage perfectly, but I was clearly not meant to be seen. I sat down and folded my hands in my lap. Conversations continued around me, though not quietly enough. "Isn't that the younger one?" someone whispered at the table ahead of mine. "The pottery girl," another voice chimed in. "Such a shame. All that education wasted." I felt my fingers tighten around the stem of my water glass, but I didn't react. I had learned something over the past year. Silence can be power when it isn't born from fear. The music softened as the lights dimmed slightly, signaling the start of the speeches. A ripple of anticipation moved through the room. My father stepped up to the microphone, commanding attention with the ease of someone who had always believed he deserved it. He smiled broadly at the crowd. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice deep and steady. 60 years is not just a milestone, it's a legacy. Applause followed on cue. He spoke about perseverance, about discipline, about building something from nothing. Each word felt carefully chosen, polished by decades of boardroom speeches. Then, with theatrical timing, he gestured toward the head table. "I am proud to introduce my eldest daughter, Stella, and my son-in-law, Travis, the only worthy heirs to this family legacy." The applause this time was louder, longer. Stella rose gracefully, smoothing her glittering dress as she accepted the admiration like oxygen. Travis stood beside her, chest puffed out, nodding with exaggerated humility. They looked triumphant, untouchable, and then Stella's eyes found mine across the dim ballroom. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her expression said everything. "This is where you belong, in the shadows." I should have felt humiliation. Instead, I felt clarity, because while she basked in a moment built on illusion, I knew something she didn't. The empire she was celebrating was hollow. The applause echoing off those high ceilings was applause for a performance, not reality. From my seat near the kitchen doors, I could see Travis stepping forward to deliver his own speech. He adjusted his tuxedo jacket nervously and raised his voice slightly louder than necessary. "We are entering a new chapter," he declared confidently. Our company is on the verge of an exclusive partnership with the Julian Group. Global expansion is just around the corner. A murmur of impressed whispers spread through the guests. I stared at him, unable to stop the faintest curve of amusement at the corner of my lips. He was announcing a deal that didn't exist, selling certainty that had already been denied. Stella noticed my expression. Her jaw tightened. She leaned toward a waiter again and whispered something sharply. Moments later, the same apologetic young man approached my table. "Miss Stella has asked that you remain seated during the formal introductions," he said quietly. Remain seated. As if I had planned to rush the stage, I nodded politely. Of course. The room felt heavier now, anticipation hanging in the air like a held breath. The speeches continued. Toasts were raised, compliments exchanged, but beneath the surface, something trembled. I felt it before I heard it, the subtle shift in attention toward the entrance. Conversations faltered. Heads began to turn. The double doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open with a firm, echoing sound that cut through the music like a blade. And suddenly, the room that had worked so hard to ignore me went completely silent. The silence that followed the sound of those doors opening was not the polite kind. It was sharp, alert, instinctive. The kind of silence that falls when power enters a room. I didn't turn immediately. I didn't need to. I felt the shift in the air before I saw him. Julian stood, framed by the golden light of the foyer, dressed in a charcoal suit tailored so precisely it seemed almost sculpted onto him. No dramatic gestures, no theatrical pause, just quiet authority. The string quartet faltered for half a second before recovering, but the damage was done. Every head in the ballroom had turned. I watched from my small table near the kitchen doors as realization rippled across the room like a shockwave. Travis saw him first. His face drained of color so quickly it was almost fascinating. He grabbed Stella's arm hard enough that she flinched, whispering something frantically in her ear. Stella's confident posture stiffened. My father turned next, scotch glass still in hand. And for the first time that night, I saw genuine uncertainty flicker across his face. Because this wasn't just any guest. This was the man Travis had been chasing for months. Julian began walking forward, unhurried. The crowd instinctively parted for him. Conversations died mid-sentence. The investors who had been politely nodding at Travis's fabricated announcement now watched with sharp, calculating eyes. My father moved first, practically pushing past a waiter to reach the entrance. His smile returned, but it was tighter now, desperate beneath its polish. "Chairman Julian," he called out warmly, extending his hand. What an unexpected honor. Julian didn't slow down. He didn't even glance at the outstretched hand. He walked straight past my father. The smile on Douglas's face froze, then fractured. Travis stepped forward next, nearly stumbling over his own shoes in his rush. "Sir, he began. Ignored. Completely. The most powerful man in the room walked past the head table, past the stage, past the cluster of elite guests who had spent the evening pretending not to look at me, and then he stopped. Right in front of my small, forgotten table near the kitchen doors. For a second, the entire ballroom held its breath. I remained seated, my hands folded calmly in my lap. My heart was beating faster now, not from fear, but from the intensity of the moment. Julian looked down at me, and his expression softened in a way no one else in that room had ever seen. "I'm sorry I'm late, Riley," he said gently, his voice carrying effortlessly across the stunned silence. "This room doesn't seem to suit you." A murmur swept through the guests, like wind through dry leaves. He extended his hand toward me. I placed mine in his, and he helped me to my feet with deliberate elegance. Then, in a gesture that was both intimate and unmistakably public, he bowed his head and pressed a soft kiss to my knuckles. The gasp that followed was almost audible as a single entity. Behind him, I could see Stella's mouth open slightly, her expression collapsing from superiority into confusion. Travis looked as though someone had pulled the floor out from under him. "Sir," Travis stammered, his voice cracking. You know my sister-in-law?" Julian turned slowly, his calm expression sharpening into something colder. "There is no misunderstanding," he replied evenly. "I know exactly who she is." My father stepped forward. attempting to recover control. "Chairman Julian," he said with forced composure, "perhaps there has been some confusion. Riley is exploring creative hobbies. She is not involved in our business matters." Creative hobbies. The words slid across the marble floor like an old insult replayed on cue. Julian's gaze did not waver. "Her studio generates twice your annual profit," he said calmly. "I would hardly call that a hobby." The sentence landed like a hammer. For a moment, no one spoke. Investors glanced at one another. The quiet calculations behind their eyes became visible. Travis attempted a laugh, thin and desperate. "Sir, perhaps we should discuss the partnership privately." "The documents I submitted?" "Yes," Julian interrupted smoothly. "The documents." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a thin folder. Not the thick blue one from earlier, just a summary sheet. He didn't raise his voice, but every syllable carried. "The financial projections you submitted were falsified, debt concealed, assets misrepresented. I do not conduct business with fraud." The word fraud echoed. Stella inhaled sharply. "That's absurd," she snapped, stepping forward. "There must be some mistake. Riley has clearly misled you." Her finger pointed at me as if I were the architect of her unraveling. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Julian's expression hardened in a way I had rarely seen. "Miss Stella," he said coolly, "my due diligence is thorough. This has nothing to do with Riley. Your company is collapsing under its own dishonesty." My father's composure cracked. "Riley," he barked suddenly, reverting to the authoritarian tone of my childhood. "Tell him there has been a misunderstanding. Tell him you have no involvement in this." I looked at him then, really looked at him. For the first time, I didn't see a giant. I saw a man scrambling to hold together a narrative that had already begun to crumble. "I have no involvement," I said quietly. Relief flashed across his face too quickly. "In your business," I finished calmly. A low ripple of reaction spread through the room. Julian's hand remained steady at the small of my back, not possessive, not controlling, just supportive. "The Julian Group will not be investing," he said clearly, turning his attention back to the room rather than the family. "And I advise any prudent investor here to examine the public records before committing further capital." It wasn't a threat. It was a verdict. The silence that followed was heavier than before. This wasn't spectacle. This was consequence. Stella's face flushed a deep, blotchy red. "You did this," she hissed at me under her breath. "You're trying to destroy us." I met her eyes steadily. "No," I said softly. "You did that yourselves." The band had stopped playing entirely now. The chandeliers still glowed, but the glamour felt brittle, like a set piece under harsh light. Julian turned slightly toward me. "Shall we?" he asked. I nodded. As we began walking toward the exit, the crowd parted again, but this time not out of admiration, out of uncertainty. The investors who had applauded moments earlier were now whispering into phones. Glasses remained half raised, forgotten. My father stood frozen near the stage, his authority stripped in real time. Just before we reached the doors, I paused, not dramatically, not for a speech. I simply looked back once. Stella stood rigid beside Travis, who appeared as though he might faint. The golden decorations, once symbols of wealth and dominance, now looked almost gaudy under the weight of exposed truth. I didn't feel triumph. I felt release. Julian opened the doors, and cool night air rushed in, washing away the heavy scent of champagne and pretense. As we stepped outside, the distant sound of the ocean reached my ears steady, grounding. Inside that ballroom, illusions had cracked, but outside, beneath the open sky, I felt something else entirely. Freedom. The morning after the party, the world felt strangely quiet. Sunlight poured through the wide windows of my kitchen, warming the marble countertop where I sat with a cup of coffee cradled between my palms. For the first time in years, I had slept without dreaming about slammed doors or shattered clay. The air felt lighter, as if something heavy had finally been lifted from my chest. Then my phone started vibrating. I didn't have to look to know who it was. The financial news channel was already playing softly in the background. the anchor's voice calm but charged with significance. A red ticker crawled across the bottom of the screen, and there it was, my father's company name, flashing beside a plunging stock line. Following last night's unexpected announcement, the reporter explained, investors have begun pulling out amid concerns of financial misrepresentation. I stared at the screen, watching the sharp vertical drop as the market opened. It didn't look like a correction. It looked like collapse. Julian stood by the stove, quietly buttering a piece of toast as if this were any other morning. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't triumphant. He was simply steady. He had done what he always did, made a decision based on integrity, not emotion. My phone vibrated again. Stella. I let it ring twice before answering. She didn't greet me. She didn't ask how I was. Her voice burst through the speaker in a mixture of sobbing and fury. "Are you happy now?" she shrieked. "You ruined everything. Do you have any idea what you've done?" I leaned back in my chair and listened, not because I enjoyed it, but because for once, I wasn't the one being accused of failure. "You humiliated us," she continued. "The investors are pulling out. The banks are calling in loans. Tell your boyfriend to fix this. Tell him to reverse it." Her voice cracked at the end, not from guilt, but from fear. I took a slow sip of coffee before responding. "You called me a disgrace yesterday," I said calmly. "Why are you begging a disgrace for help now?" There was silence on the other end, brief, stunned. "You're selfish," she snapped. "Blood should mean something." I almost smiled. "Blood meant something to me too," I replied quietly, "until you used it as leverage." She began shouting again, but I ended the call before her words could reach me. My hand didn't tremble. My chest didn't tighten. It felt clean. The phone lit up almost immediately again. "Douglas." For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but I answered. His tone was exactly the same as it had been my entire life, commanding, authoritative, as if volume alone could manufacture control. "You will bring Julian to dinner tonight," he ordered. "We need to discuss the contract. This can be salvaged. No apology. No acknowledgement of the past. Not even a mention of the night he threw me out." I glanced at Julian, who had quietly turned on the speaker function without a word. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. "I don't think you understand the situation," my father continued. "This family built you. You owe us cooperation." "Built me." The words echoed hollowly. "You built a house," I said slowly. "I built myself." He exhaled sharply, irritation bleeding through his composure. "Don't be dramatic. You're still my daughter." The sentence should have softened me. It didn't. "You told me I wasn't your daughter the night you threw me into the rain," I reminded him. "You said I was worthless." Silence. For the first time in my memory, he didn't immediately respond. "I'm not your daughter anymore," I said gently but firmly. "I'm your competitor." Then I ended the call, not in anger, not in revenge, in clarity. I opened my phone settings and blocked every number associated with that house. One by one, Stella, Travis, Douglas, even the landline. With each tap, I felt something untangle inside me. The following weeks unfolded quickly, almost ruthlessly. News outlets picked up the story. Analysts dissected the financial inconsistencies Julian had referenced. The company's reputation eroded at a speed no public relations team could contain. Creditors called in debts. Partnerships dissolved. Within a month, the company officially filed for bankruptcy. The Newport estate, the same mansion where I had once been exiled to the shadows near the kitchen doors, was listed for sale. I drove past it once, weeks later, out of curiosity. The gates were open. A for sale sign stood where family pride used to reside. It didn't feel victorious. It felt inevitable. Stella and Travis didn't survive the fallout together. The stress of financial ruin exposed fractures in their marriage that money had once concealed. Their arguments became public, their accusations louder than their former celebrations. Eventually, divorce papers were filed, and the golden couple fractured under pressure. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Stella had taken a job at a small diner outside town. Travis moved back in with his parents. The country club memberships vanished. The carefully curated circle of friends dispersed. And my father? He moved into a modest apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. No manicured lawns, no crystal chandeliers, just thin walls and neighbors who didn't know his legacy. I thought I would feel satisfaction seeing the empire crumble. Instead, I felt something more complicated. Grief not for the money or the mansion, but for the version of a father I once believed I had. The one who might have hugged me when I first brought home a handmade bowl instead of dismissing it. The one who might have attended my studio opening without calculating profit margins. But grief doesn't mean regret, because while their world contracted, mine expanded. Julian and I held a small engagement ceremony on a quiet stretch of coastline not far from where the party had taken place. There were no investors, no photographers, just close friends, Chloe among them, standing barefoot in the sand as the sun dipped into the horizon. When Julian slipped the ring onto my finger, it wasn't about status. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about partnership, about choosing someone who chooses you back without conditions. As the ocean waves rolled in steadily behind us, I realized something profound. Revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's silent growth. Sometimes it's walking away instead of striking back. The sweetest part wasn't watching them fall. It was realizing I no longer needed them to see me rise. If there's anything this journey taught me, it's this. You are not defined by the expectations placed on you. You are not obligated to remain in environments that diminish you simply because you share DNA. Family should be shelter, not storm. And if the storm refuses to calm, you have every right to sail toward clearer skies. I used to think success meant earning my father's approval. Now I know it means living without needing it. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized this story was never just about revenge. It wasn't about humiliating my sister or watching my father's empire collapse. It was about something much quieter and much more powerful. It was about reclaiming my worth in a room that once made me feel invisible. It was about understanding that success isn't proving others wrong. It's finally believing you were never wrong to begin with. So many of us grow up chasing approval from people who only know how to measure value in one way. And when we don't fit their mold, we're labeled the disappointment, the rebel, the failure. But sometimes, being rejected is the very thing that forces us to build something real, something honest, something entirely our own. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed by the people who were supposed to support you, I hope it reminded you that your comeback doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. Thank you for listening to my story. If you enjoy emotional, thought-provoking stories about resilience, betrayal, and rising stronger than ever, please subscribe to Revenge Drama House. Your support helps this channel continue sharing stories that inspire courage and quiet strength. I'll see you in the next story.